Coleman Hughes, American writer and podcaster, schools Joe Rogan about the Israel-Hamas war.
I agree with all of the absolute tragedy and suffering of the Palestinian people, but it's what creates that is the way Hamas fights.
I have a question for everybody that is watching. At what point in your life, or should I say over the past 6 months, did the light bulb go off in your head and say, they are transparent, they are honest, they are doing the right thing, and they are protecting the people who need to be protected, and therefore they have my support? Throughout history, when it has come to warfare between two or more countries, two or more sides, if you will, as individuals, we have the decision to choose a side to support. The side that we think has not done what they are actually being accused of doing, or that side in fact has valid justification and supporting evidence to defend themselves during war. And the truth is that most people have not been to the Middle East, Israel, or Palestine. And they haven't spent the time required to understand the historical context that has led us to this situation. So I'll ask you again, when did you suddenly make the decision and commitment to side with a terrorist organization?
How many thousands have been killed?
So according to Gaza Health Ministry, which is run by Hamas, the number they have is 32,000, but they don't distinguish between Hamas and civilians. So Hamas says 32,000 people have been killed, civilians and soldiers. Israel says 13,000 soldiers have been killed by Israel.
This is an extremely critical part of the conversation. Joe Rogan, with one of the largest, if not the largest podcast in the world, is also consuming loads of information and doing research about this topic. However, he presents his side, his case, his opinion, and his perspective without an actual framework which is really a true reflection of what we are seeing unfold. It's already April, we're 6 months into this war, and we have already uncovered loads of evidence showing that the Gazan Health Ministry is in fact run by Hamas. The same people who came into Israel on October 7th and mutilated innocent people, the same people who took hostages back into Gaza, the same people who hide under civilians inside of tunnels, and the same people who control the narrative for their own benefit around the world to make them look innocent. And all of these numbers being reported are not a reflection of true statistics. Like Coleman, I personally think what is happening is sad, it's terrible, and it's awful. Nobody would ever want to see that happen. But you need to take a deeper look into the situation to understand why these things are happening. And maybe after you can go back to the original question and ask yourself who you really trust now.
But if both of those numbers are accurate, which they may or may not be, that would be 13,000 soldiers killed, 19,000 civilians killed, which for urban combat in the Middle East is a very normal ratio.
I see what you're saying if you wanted to look at it cold and objectively. Yeah.
For urban combat in the Middle East, this is a very common ratio. So why has the ratio been taken out of proportion suddenly? I find it appalling that the one incident that happened, which was the worst atrocity against Israel in the history of its state, is the same exact incident that now the world is blaming Israel for. In what world does that make sense? According to the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University, 940,000 people have been killed by direct war in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, and Pakistan. Nearly 1 million people in over 5 countries in the Middle East have died because of war. And a lot of these deaths and fighting were a result of multiple Muslim countries fighting with one another. So where is the outcry? Where is the outrage? Where are the people condemning that? So what rebuttal do you have exactly?
But
I hope it doesn't come across cold because...
But it's mostly women and children that are dying, that are dying because they're in a place where these terrorists are, right? I mean, it's not...
Because the terrorists on purpose embed themselves with the civilian population, which is a war crime.
Right, which is a strategy that they have clearly employed when you see them. And when the IDF went into that hospital and found Hamas...
Just recently?
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's real. It's not just a conspiracy theory. We know that that's real.
Joe is not wrong about the fact that many women and children are dying as a result of where Hamas is hiding. I've said it before and I'll say it again. It's awful, it's sad, it's bad, and I don't wish for the death of any innocent civilians during war. And nor should you, or anybody with a good heart. But you have to listen closely to what Coleman says. The terrorists, Hamas, embed themselves within civilian populations. It's not a secret anymore. They literally hide inside of tunnels underneath the ground. They dress up as regular civilians. They dress up as hospital clerks, paramedics, clergy staff, medical staff. They do everything by the book according to the definition of using their civilians as human shields. And Joe Rogan knows too, that's not a secret. And he acknowledges that they do this, that they implement this strategy every single day. And if you are still in denial, then you have to acknowledge it too. This context matters. It matters so much because it can make one person realize that their nice opinion and perspective of theirs is not really a just one.
And I think that the fundamental difference between Israel and Hamas is Israeli society, however imperfectly, is not going to celebrate the monsters on their own side when they're really found to be monsters. They're not gonna hand out candies to people who kill Palestinian civilians like Hamas does.
Coleman hit the nail on the head. Palestinians in the streets of Gaza celebrated when Hamas brought back hostages into the Gaza Strip. They handed out sweets and candy and desserts to people to celebrate. They lit firecrackers, fireworks, and danced in the street. And yes, many of these Palestinians joined Hamas on October 7th. In Israel, in the Israeli society, citizens don't just go handing out candy to their neighbors or children. When the IDF is inside of the Gaza Strip trying to get Hamas, and civilians are hurt in the middle as a result of Hamas's war crimes. Israelis don't jump over the border fence into the Gaza Strip to join the IDF trying to get Hamas and also return all of the hostages back home. The point is that Israelis don't thrive off of instigating violence and attacks on a regular basis the same way that Hamas does.
I think Israel, however imperfectly, is doing the opposite. They're trying to minimize civilian casualties.
There have been, for sure, targeting of mosques, like, for instance. Do you think that's because Hamas uses these mosques?
Absolutely.
So when they're blowing up their infrastructure and bombing the mosques and bombing whatever it is, schools, they're doing it because Hamas is in those schools?
They're doing it because they have good faith intelligence that Hamas is in those schools.
The case that has been made against Israel is that they are continuously dropping airstrikes and entering Gaza and letting up the city, killing as many innocent civilians as possible. The thing is that could not be further from the truth. Every single decision that the IDF makes must be a calculated one to see what the cost is of doing an attack. They are considering the civilian population around where Hamas is hiding. They are making phone calls in Arabic to people to tell them to evacuate. They are dropping pamphlets from the air in Arabic to encourage people to leave and evacuate. They are opening up humanitarian corridors inside of the Gaza Strip. And the IDF are literally protecting citizens from Hamas inside of Gaza. They shelter them, they give them food, they give them supplies, they try to limit civilian casualty as much as possible. What else can you ask for? What other implementations can an enemy incorporate into their strategy to reduce civilian casualty? All of these calculated decisions are the exact ones that Hamas disregards. Because no matter how calculated or not calculated something is that they decide to do, the decision doesn't actually matter to them as long as it has the potential to do as much damage and violence as possible. And that is exactly where Hamas's military considerations and calculations end. And that is the difference.
Yeah, the laws of war say you cannot target a church, a mosque, a hospital, but if the enemy turns that hospital into a military operation site, as Hamas does, which is it's routine for them, then it can become legitimate.
Hamas has tunnels underneath the ground. And they stay inside of these tunnels because when they know Israel is going to retaliate, they will have a safe space to be protected in. They couldn't actually care less about what is happening upstairs to their own Palestinian people. Hamas takes their rocket launchers, their military compounds, and some of their HQs, and they embed them right into, underneath, and next to places like schools, hospitals, mosques, and residential neighborhoods. They do this flawlessly because they understand that by embedding themselves into the society of women and kids in schools and mosques and hospitals and residential neighborhoods, Israel will not only have a harder time finding them, but also the world will eventually blame Israel for attacking these areas as we see all of this unfold. And Joe Rogan knows it too.
What's unique about this war, unlike every other war that I could think of, is you have an army in Hamas that has perfected the art of embedding itself and meshing itself with civilians so that you cannot hit them without hitting the people around them. None have perfected it to the extent that Hamas has.
No other army in the world has flawlessly perfected what Hamas has. They have essentially created themselves a win-win situation on almost every single front. They get to enter Israeli soil, commit barbaric acts of terror, film and stream this entire day, mutilate many human beings, take as many people as hostages back into the Gaza Strip, continue to attack Israel via airstrikes, and also encourage their friends up north or down south to contribute too. And while doing this whole thing, they get to use their own civilians as pawns on a chessboard to create this flawless narrative being told across the world that Israel are the people killing innocent civilians. They achieved what they wanted to on October 7th. They took back hundreds of hostages. Then they go back home, hide underneath the ground, and wait for Israel to respond while they're all protected and okay, and their civilians are upstairs waiting to suffer. What this whole thing is disgustingly flawless, if you ask me.
No army that I know of in military history has had 15 years to build 300 miles of tunnel underneath a city so that they can operate right under a kindergarten, right under a mosque. So this is a challenge no army has faced. And so that's what makes this war different.
The ratio of combatants to civilians in this war is actually better than when the US Army got ISIS out of Mosul. Back then, the ratio was 10,000 civilians to 4,000 ISIS members. But here in the Hamas-Israel war, you have 19,000 civilians to 13,000 members of Hamas. And the only way to actually achieve a successful ratio like that, according to the numbers, is to apply calculated risk, strategy, and implementation. The only actual way to achieve a successful kill-death ratio is if you do indeed do everything in your power to limit civilian casualty. And these are all of the things that Israel and the IDF have been doing and will continue to do, because they do not waver from operating as the most humane and civil military in the world. And guess what? Numbers do not lie, and they are right in front of you.
I agree with all of the absolute tragedy and suffering of the Palestinian people, but it's what creates that is the way Hamas fights. And either we can say one of two things. We can either say, well, Israel doesn't have a clean shot, and so they have to let Hamas get away with it.
What creates the humanitarian aid not being delivered to the people who need the humanitarian aid is the way that Hamas fights. What creates the women and children at schools and mosques getting hurt is the way that Hamas fights. What creates all of this human suffering inside of the Gaza Strip is the way that Hamas fights. And they fight by oppressing their very own people. So let me ask you this. Who is the real oppressor? Israel or Hamas?
But then we are essentially creating a situation where terrorists have found the perfect solution, which is that you can cross the border, go house to house slaughtering your enemies, and then hide behind your own people and they can do nothing about it. It's a perfect strategy.
And this is exactly what Hamas wants. This is their end goal. This whole thing was drawn up on their board years ago when they were creating their charter, when they created this terrorist organization and their rules of operation. They wanted to create such a vile, evil, and corrupt terrorist organization on earth, disguised by this illusion that they are actually the victims, and then leave others who are trying to defend themselves with really no choice but to put their guns down. And this would let Hamas win. This is exactly where they want the world right now. They have you just like this.
Can we live in a world where we allow that to be an acceptable strategy? I don't think so. It's heartbreaking, and I completely understand why people don't think the way I think when they see the videos. I completely get it. But I don't think we can actually live in a world where that's allowed to be a strategy.
I appreciate your perspective.
Yeah.
I see what you're saying. Yeah. You clearly know more about it than I do.
Have you asked yourself that question? Are you able to live in a world where this strategy does exist? The fight between Hamas and Israel maybe hasn't come knocking on your door. You might be watching this video right now somewhere abroad, and all you have seen up to this point are images, videos, and propaganda coming out of the Middle East. And so you come up with your own opinion based on the information that you've consumed or conversations that you've had with other people. But when you take a deeper look under the hood and understand that this war is not just about Israel and Palestine or Jews and Muslims, that it is about a movement trying to achieve a world takeover. And until the devil comes knocking on your door, you will continue to point fingers at and just blame the people who you have ultimately decided are not doing the right thing. But the reality is how can we, as a human society, live in a world where what Hamas, this terrorist organization, has pulled off and is continuing to pull off? How is it that we are not doing what all of us know we are capable of doing to stop the spread of this cancer? And I'll tell you right now that this cancer will spread beyond the borders of the Middle East. And that is their ultimate goal. That is what they are chasing. So, last question for you. This same terrorist organization, Hamas, which is committing every single crime possible across the charts, they are the organization that many of you watching have chosen to trust and support, the same way I called you out on it at the beginning of this video. But now, remind me real quick, when exactly did they earn your trust and support?